When legendary actor Gene Hackman walked onto the set of what was supposed to be his next major film project, he had no idea that within hours he would make a decision that would end the entire production and send shockwaves through Hollywood. The year was 1987, and Hackman, already a two-time Academy Award winner with an unshakable reputation for integrity, was about to face a moment that would test everything he stood for as both an artist and a human being. What happened next would become one of the most talked about incidents in film industry history, a story of moral courage that still resonates today. Before we dive into this incredible tale, comment where you're watching from today. We love hearing from our global audience. The morning sun cast long shadows across the sprawling studio lot in Burbank, California, as crews prepared for what everyone expected to be the first day of a major motion picture. The air buzzed with the familiar energy of a big-budget production, grips hauling equipment, electricians rigging lights, and costume assistants rushing between trailers with armfuls of wardrobe. It was the kind of organized chaos that Hackman had witnessed countless times throughout his illustrious career, yet today felt different somehow. There was an undercurrent of tension that seemed to permeate the usual pre-production excitement, a subtle shift in the atmosphere that only someone with Hackman's experience could detect. Gene Hackman arrived at the studio that morning in his characteristic understated manner. Unlike many of his Hollywood contemporaries who traveled in luxury vehicles with entourages, Hackman drove himself in a modest sedan, preferring simplicity over spectacle. At 67 years old, he carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had nothing left to prove. His weathered face bore the lines of someone who had lived fully, each wrinkle telling a story of triumph, struggle, and unwavering principle. He wore a simple button-down shirt and comfortable jeans, his silver hair neatly combed but unpretentious. To an outside observer, he might have been mistaken for a seasoned crew member rather than one of the most respected actors of his generation. The project that had brought Hackman to the studio was a psychological thriller titled Crossroads of Justice, a film that promised to explore themes of racial tension and moral complexity in contemporary America. The script had initially attracted Hackman because of its nuanced approach to difficult subject matter and its potential to spark meaningful conversations about social justice. He had spent weeks preparing for his role as Detective Marcus Sullivan, a veteran police officer forced to confront his own biases while investigating a racially charged murder case. The character represented the kind of complex, morally ambiguous role that Hackman had built his career on. Men who weren't entirely good or evil, but deeply human in their struggles with conscience and circumstance. As Hackman made his way across the lot toward the production offices, he nodded politely to the various crew members who recognized him. Despite his fame, he had always maintained a reputation for treating everyone on set with equal respect, from the director to the craft services worker. This wasn't an act or a calculated move for public relations. It was simply who Gene Hackman was. His upbringing in a working-class family in Illinois had instilled in him a deep appreciation for honest work and the dignity of every individual, regardless of their position in life. These values had guided him through decades in an industry notorious for its ego-driven hierarchies and casual cruelties. The production offices were housed in a series of connected trailers, their temporary nature belying the millions of dollars invested in the project. Hackman pushed through the door of the main office, expecting to find the usual pre-production meeting with department heads discussing final details before cameras rolled. Instead, he walked into what appeared to be a heated discussion between the film's director, William Prescott, and several studio executives. The conversation stopped abruptly when they noticed Hackman's arrival, and the sudden silence filled the room with an uncomfortable tension that made the veteran actor's instincts immediately kick into high alert. William. Prescott was a director in his early 40s who had made a name for himself with several commercially successful but critically unremarkable films. He possessed the kind of smooth confidence that came naturally to those who had never been told, no by the industry power brokers. His expensive suit and perfectly styled hair spoke to his position in the Hollywood hierarchy, but there was something in his eyes that morning that suggested he was operating under pressure from forces beyond his control. He greeted Hackman with a forced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, extending a hand that felt cold and slightly damp when they shook. The studio executives present were a familiar breed to Hackman, middle-aged men in expensive suits who viewed filmmaking primarily as a numbers game rather than an artistic endeavor. They carried themselves with the particular arrogance that comes from wielding financial power in an industry built on dreams and creativity. Their presence in what should have been a routine production meeting was the first clear sign that something was seriously amiss with the project. Hackman had worked with enough studios over the years to recognize when business considerations were threatening to override artistic integrity, and every instinct he had developed over decades in the industry was now screaming warnings. The conversation that had been interrupted by Hackman's arrival seemed to pick up where it had left off, though now with more coded language and careful euphemisms. The executives spoke in the corporate doublespeak that had become standard in Hollywood boardrooms, discussing market demographics and audience appeal and commercial viability. But underneath their carefully chosen words, Hackman could sense a deeper conflict brewing. The script he had agreed to star in featured several prominent African-American characters, including a young black detective who served as a crucial ally to Hackman's character and a civil rights attorney who played a pivotal role in the film's climactic courtroom scenes. Director Prescott seemed increasingly uncomfortable as the meeting progressed, frequently glancing at Hackman as if seeking some kind of support or understanding. The actor remained silent, observing the dynamics in the room with the same attention to detail that had made him such a compelling screen presence for over 2 decades. He noticed how the executives avoided making direct eye contact when certain topics arose, how their language became more vague when discussing specific aspects of the script, and how the overall energy in the room felt more like a corporate damage control session than a creative collaboration. One of the senior executives, a man named Bradley Worthington, who held a vice president title at the studio, finally addressed the elephant in the room with what he clearly believed was diplomatic subtlety. He suggested that the film might perform better in certain markets if some of the supporting roles were adjusted to better reflect what he termed traditional audience expectations. The language was carefully chosen to avoid saying anything explicitly offensive, but the implication was crystal clear to everyone present. Worthington spoke with the casual confidence of someone who had made similar suggestions countless times before and expected them to be received as reasonable business decisions rather than moral compromises. Hackman felt a familiar cold sensation in his stomach, the same feeling he had experienced as a young man when confronted with injustice he was powerless to stop. But he was no longer a powerless young man struggling to make his way in an indifferent industry. He was Gene Hackman, with sufficient clout and financial security to speak his mind without fear of career consequences. As the meeting continued and the executive's suggestions became more specific and more disturbing, Hackman found himself thinking about the young African-American actors who had been cast in the film, talented performers who were counting on this project to advance their careers and tell their stories on screen. The discussion continued for another 20 minutes, with Prescott offering increasingly weak protests against the studio's demands, while the executives pressed their case with the relentless logic of profit margins and market research. They presented their arguments as if they were simply stating obvious facts about the entertainment business, rather than asking everyone present to participate in a system of discrimination that went against everything the film was supposed to represent. The irony was palpable. Here they were, preparing to make a movie about confronting racial prejudice, while simultaneously perpetuating that very prejudice in their business decisions. As the meeting drew toward what seemed like an inevitable conclusion in favor of the studio's position, Hackman realized that a moment of truth was rapidly approaching. Everything he had built his career on, his reputation for integrity, his commitment to meaningful storytelling, his respect for the dignity of all people, was about to be put to the ultimate test. The choice before him was stark and uncompromising. Participate in a project that contradicted his fundamental values, or take a stand that would likely cost him millions of dollars and potentially damage important professional relationships. The weight of the decision was made heavier by Hackman's awareness of how many people were depending on this project for their livelihoods. Hundreds of crew members had already been hired, locations had been secured, equipment had been rented, and an entire economic ecosystem had been built around the assumption that Crossroads of Justice would move forward as planned. If Hackman walked away, it wouldn't just be his own career that would be affected. It would send ripples throughout the entire production, potentially destroying the dreams and financial security of countless innocent people who had no role in the studio's discriminatory decisions. Yet as he sat in that trailer, listening to powerful men casually discuss eliminating opportunities for black actors as if it were no more significant than adjusting a catering budget, Hackman knew that some principles were worth more than money or convenience. His mind wandered back to his childhood in Illinois, where his parents had taught him that a person's character was defined not by what they did when it was easy, but by what they did when it was hard. He thought about the civil rights leaders he had admired from afar, people who had sacrificed their comfort and security to fight for justice and equality. Most of all, he thought about the kind of man he wanted to be when he looked at himself in the mirror each morning. The meeting was reaching its conclusion, with Prescott apparently ready to capitulate to the studio's demands, when Gene Hackman finally spoke up. His voice was quiet, but carried the unmistakable authority of someone who had made up his mind about something fundamental and unchangeable. The words that came out of Gene Hackman's mouth would be remembered and repeated throughout Hollywood for decades to come, but in the moment he spoke them, they felt as natural and inevitable as breathing. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice carrying the same measured cadence he had used to deliver some of cinema's most memorable lines, "I think there's been a fundamental misunderstanding about what kind of film we're making here." The temperature in the trailer seemed to drop several degrees as everyone present realized that the legendary actor was not going to simply go along with the studio's demands. Hackman's reputation for professionalism was matched only by his reputation for unwavering principle, and the expression on his weathered face made it clear that they were about to witness the latter in action. Bradley Worthington, the studio executive who had been leading the charge for the script changes, attempted to maintain the diplomatic tone that had characterized the meeting up to that point. He smiled the practiced smile of someone accustomed to managing difficult talent and suggested that perhaps Hackman didn't fully understand the commercial realities of modern filmmaking. "Gene," he said, with the false familiarity that studio executives often employed with major stars, "we're all on the same team here. We want to make the best possible film while ensuring it reaches the widest possible audience. Sometimes that requires difficult decisions about casting and content." His words were carefully chosen to sound reasonable and collaborative, but Hackman could hear the underlying condescension, the assumption that artistic concerns should always bow to financial considerations. What happened next would become the Stuff of Hollywood legend, though at the time it felt like the most natural thing in the world to Gene Hackman. He stood up slowly from his chair, his full height commanding attention even in the cramped confines of the production trailer. At 6 feet tall, he wasn't particularly imposing physically, but there was something in his bearing that demanded respect, the quiet authority that comes from decades of living according to one's principles, even when it wasn't convenient or profitable. "I understand the realities perfectly," he replied, his voice remaining calm but gaining an edge that anyone who had watched his films would recognize. "What I don't understand is how we can make a film about fighting prejudice while practicing it ourselves." The silence that followed Hackman's words was deafening. Director William Prescott looked like a man caught between two impossible choices, his eyes darting between the studio executives who controlled his career and the star whose presence was essential to the film's success. The other people in the room, assistant directors, producers, and various hangers-on, suddenly found urgent business with their phones or paperwork, desperate to avoid being caught in the crossfire of what was rapidly escalating from a business discussion to a moral confrontation. Only Bradley Worthington seemed prepared to continue the battle, his jaw tightening as he realized that Gene Hackman was not going to be as easily managed as he had assumed. Worthington's response revealed the true nature of the studio's position. With a clarity that surprised even Hackman, gone was the diplomatic doublespeak about market research and audience demographics. "Look, Gene," the executive said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "let's be honest about what we're dealing with. Here, this is a business, not a sociology experiment. We've got investors to answer to, exhibitors to satisfy, and profit margins to maintain. The reality is that films with significant black leads simply don't perform as well in certain key markets, both domestic and international. That's not prejudice, that's mathematics." The executive's words hung in the air like a noxious cloud, their naked cynicism creating a moment of crystalline clarity for everyone present. Here was the truth that Hollywood had been dancing around for decades, stated with the brutal honesty that only comes from someone who believes they hold all the power in a situation. Worthington seemed genuinely puzzled by Hackman's resistance, as if he couldn't understand why a seasoned professional would allow personal feelings to interfere with business decisions. In his worldview, discrimination wasn't a moral failing. It was simply another market force to be accommodated, like weather or consumer trends. But Bradley Worthington had seriously miscalculated both Gene Hackman's character and his position in the industry power structure. The actor had reached a point in his career where he could afford to walk away from any project that compromised his values. And more importantly, he had reached a point in his life where he felt morally obligated to do so. "You're absolutely right," Hackman said with a slight smile that didn't reach his eyes. "This is a business, and my business is acting in films that I can be proud of, with people I can respect. It appears we have a fundamental disagreement about what constitutes good business." The veteran actor began gathering his personal items from the table, his script, his reading glasses, his coffee cup, with the deliberate movements of someone who had made an irrevocable decision. Director Prescott finally found his voice, though it came out as little more than a desperate whisper. "Gene, please, let's not be hasty here. Maybe we can find some kind of compromise, some middle ground that works for everyone." The desperation in Prescott's voice was palpable. He understood better than anyone else in the room that without Hackman, there was no film. The entire project had been greenlit based on the actor's involvement, and his departure would mean not just financial loss, but professional humiliation for everyone associated with the production. Hackman paused in his preparations to leave and looked directly at the director with something approaching sympathy. William Prescott was trapped in a system that demanded moral compromises as the price of professional success, and Hackman recognized the genuine anguish of a man caught between his artistic aspirations and his financial obligations. "Bill," he said quietly, using the director's nickname for the first time that morning, "there is no middle ground here. Either we make a film that treats all people with dignity and respect, or we don't. Either we cast the best actors for the roles regardless of their race, or we perpetuate a system that denies opportunities based on skin color. There's no compromise between right and wrong." The power dynamic in the room shifted dramatically as other people began to process what was happening. The assistant directors and producers who had been trying to remain invisible suddenly realized that they were witnessing history in the making, the moment when one of Hollywood's most respected actors took a public stand against industry racism. Cell phones began discreetly appearing as people started making urgent calls to agents, lawyers, and studio heads. Word of Hackman's defiance would spread through the industry gossip network within hours, carrying implications that extended far beyond this single production. Bradley Worthington made one final attempt to salvage the situation, his corporate composure beginning to crack under the pressure of watching millions of dollars disappear before his eyes. "Gene, you're making a mistake here. This industry has certain realities that none of us created. We're just trying to work within the system as it exists. If you walk away from this project, you're not changing anything. You're just hurting a lot of innocent people who are counting on this film for their livelihoods." His argument was calculated to appeal to Hackman's well-known concern for working people, an attempt to turn the actor's conscience against itself. But Hackman had already considered that argument and found it wanting. "You're right that I'm not single-handedly changing the system," he replied, shouldering his bag and moving toward the trailer door. "But I'm not going to be complicit in perpetuating it either. Every time someone with the power to say no chooses to say yes instead, the system gets a little bit stronger. Every time someone chooses principle over profit, it gets a little bit weaker. I've made my choice." His hand was on the door handle when he turned back for one final observation that would be quoted in industry publications for years to come. "You know what the real mathematics are, Bradley? The mathematics of looking at yourself in the mirror every morning and knowing what kind of person you chose to be." The door closed behind Gene Hackman with a soft click that somehow sounded as final as a gunshot in the stunned silence of the production trailer. Through the window, those remaining could see him walking across the lot with the same unhurried pace he had used to arrive that morning, his posture straight and his head held high. There was no drama in his departure, no angry gestures or shouted accusations, just the quiet dignity of a man who had made peace with a difficult decision and was prepared to live with the consequences. Within minutes of Hackman's departure, the production trailer erupted into frantic activity as phone calls were made and crisis management protocols were activated. But even as studio executives scrambled to salvage what they could from the wreckage of their carefully laid plans, everyone present understood that something fundamental had just occurred. One of Hollywood's most bankable stars had just walked away from a major motion picture rather than participate in racial discrimination, and the reverberations of that decision would be felt throughout the industry for months to come. The legend of Gene Hackman's principled stand was already beginning to take shape, destined to inspire future generations of artists and activists who would face their own moments of moral choice. The news of Gene Hackman's dramatic departure from crossroads of justice spread through Hollywood with the velocity of wildfire in drought conditions. Within 2 hours of his exit from the production trailer, entertainment reporters were working their phones. Agents were fielding urgent calls from panicked clients, and studio executives across town were hastily convening emergency meetings to assess the potential impact on their own projects. The story had everything that the industry gossip machine thrived on: a beloved star, millions of dollars at stake, and a moral controversy that touched on one of Hollywood's most sensitive subjects. But this wasn't just another celebrity scandal. It was a seismic shift that would force the entire industry to confront uncomfortable truths about itself. The immediate aftermath at the studio was nothing short of chaos. Director William Prescott found himself at the center of a maelstrom as executives, lawyers, agents, and publicists descended on the production offices like vultures circling a fresh carcass. The carefully orchestrated schedule that had been planned for the first day of shooting was abandoned as everyone involved in the project tried to figure out what could be salvaged from the wreckage. Phone calls were made to insurance companies to determine what kind of coverage existed for star departures, while accountants began calculating the financial impact of shutting down a production that had already spent millions in pre-production. Costs. Bradley Worthington, the studio executive whose blunt statements about market realities had triggered Hackman's walkout, found himself transformed overnight from a rising star in the corporate hierarchy to a potential scapegoat for one of the most expensive moral stands in Hollywood history. His superiors demanded explanations for how a routine business meeting had escalated into a public relations nightmare that was already generating negative headlines in the trade publications. Industry insiders who had known Worthington for years suddenly found themselves too busy to take his calls, demonstrating the brutal speed with which Hollywood could isolate those who had fallen from grace. Meanwhile, across town in his modest home in the Hollywood Hills, Gene Hackman was experiencing the peculiar calm that often follows a moment of decisive action. He had spent the morning working in his garden, finding solace in the simple act of tending to his tomato plants, while his phone rang continuously with calls from reporters, agents, and fellow actors seeking comment on his unprecedented decision. His wife Martha answered most of the calls with polite deflections, protecting her husband's privacy while he processed the magnitude of what had just occurred. For Hackman, the decision to walk away had felt inevitable once the studio's true intentions became clear, but he understood that the consequences were only beginning to unfold. The first major industry figure to publicly comment on Hackman's actions was veteran director Sidney Lumet, who had worked with the actor on several occasions and understood both his character and his clout within the industry. In a statement released through his publicist that afternoon, Lumet praised Hackman's unwavering commitment to artistic integrity and human dignity, while noting that Gene has once again demonstrated why he is considered one of the finest actors of his generation, not just for his talent, but for his character. The statement was carefully worded, but unmistakably supportive, giving other industry figures permission to voice their own admiration for Hackman's stand. As word of the incident spread, it reached the offices of the NAACP and other civil rights organizations, who immediately recognized the significance of a major white star walking away from a lucrative project rather than participate in racial discrimination. Dr. Benjamin Hooks, the executive director of the NAACP at the time, issued a statement commending Hackman for demonstrating the kind of moral leadership that we need more of in all industries, not just entertainment. The statement went on to note that Hollywood's discriminatory practices had been an ongoing concern for civil rights organizations, and that Hackman's actions represented a powerful example of how individuals can make a difference when they choose principle over profit. The response from African American actors and filmmakers was swift and overwhelmingly positive. Danny Glover, who was at the height of his Lethal Weapon fame, told a reporter that Hackman's actions were a reminder that true solidarity isn't just about words, It's about being willing to sacrifice something meaningful for what's right. Spike Lee, never one to shy away from controversial topics, was more direct in his assessment. Gene Hackman just did something that most people in this town wouldn't have the courage to do. He looked evil in the face and said no, even when it cost him money. That's what real integrity looks like. But the response wasn't universally positive, and the divisions that emerged revealed the deep fault lines that existed within the entertainment industry regarding race and representation. Some industry veterans, speaking anonymously to trade publications, criticized Hackman for what they viewed as grandstanding that would ultimately hurt the very people he claimed to be helping. This kind of moral posturing might make Gene feel better about himself, one unnamed producer told Variety, but it just killed hundreds of jobs and sent a message to studios that films with diverse casts are too risky to greenlight. He's actually set back the cause he thinks he's advancing. The financial implications of Hackman's departure were staggering and immediate. Crossroads of Justice had been budgeted at $45 million, with a significant portion of that money already spent on pre-production costs, location fees, and crew salaries. The insurance policies that studios typically carried for such contingencies had specific exclusions for voluntary departures by key talent, meaning that much of the loss would have to be absorbed directly by the studio. Stock prices for the parent company dropped 2 points in after-hours trading as investors processed the news, representing a paper loss of nearly $100 million in market capitalization. More significantly, the incident sent shockwaves through other productions that were in various stages of development. Studios began quietly reviewing scripts and casting decisions for projects that might be vulnerable to similar moral challenges from their star talent. Several films that had been green-lit with diverse casts suddenly found themselves subjected to additional scrutiny from nervous executives who were now acutely aware that their business practices might be called into question by the very actors they were paying millions to employ. The media coverage of the story evolved throughout the day, with early reports focusing on the financial aspects of the production shutdown, gradually giving way to deeper examinations of the underlying issues that had triggered Hackman's dramatic exit. Entertainment journalists who had covered Hollywood for decades noted that while star walkouts were not uncommon, it was virtually unprecedented for a major actor to leave a project specifically over racial discrimination concerns. The story was particularly compelling because Hackman's reputation for professionalism and reliability made it clear that his decision had not been made lightly or for personal gain. By evening, the story had transcended the entertainment industry and was being covered by mainstream news outlets as a significant cultural moment. Network news broadcasts featured segments on Hollywood's troubled history with racial representation, using Hackman's actions as a jumping-off point for broader discussions about discrimination in the entertainment industry. The timing couldn't have been more perfect from a cultural perspective, as the country was grappling with ongoing conversations about racial justice that had been building throughout the 1980s. The response from the younger generation of actors was particularly noteworthy, as many saw Hackman's actions as a model for how established performers could use their privilege and power to create opportunities for marginalized communities. Several up-and-coming actors, both white and black, publicly praised Hackman's decision and suggested that it represented a new model for how the industry might address its systemic problems with representation and equality. The international response to the story was equally significant, particularly in European markets where American films generated substantial revenue for Hollywood studios. Several prominent European film critics and industry figures used Hackman's stand as an opportunity to criticize Hollywood's export of American racial attitudes through its films. A particularly pointed editorial in the British film magazine Sight and Sound noted that Gene Hackman has reminded us that cinema has a moral dimension that transcends commercial considerations and that artists have a responsibility to consider the broader impact of their work on society. As the day wore on, it became clear that Hackman's decision was resonating far beyond the entertainment industry. College campuses across the country saw impromptu discussions about the role of individuals in challenging institutional racism, with many students citing Hackman's example as proof that meaningful change could begin with personal moral choices. Civil rights organizations that had been struggling to maintain public attention for their causes suddenly found themselves with a powerful example of solidarity from an unexpected source. The long-term implications of the day's events were only beginning to become apparent, but already there were signs that Hackman's actions would have lasting effects on how the industry approached questions of diversity and representation. Several prominent talent agencies quietly began reaching out to their African-American clients to assure them that the agencies were committed to fighting for better opportunities and fairer treatment. Studio development executives started receiving calls from writers and producers proposing projects with diverse casts, sensing that the political landscape had shifted in ways that might make such films more commercially viable. As night fell over Hollywood, Gene Hackman remained in his garden, finally taking some calls from close friends and colleagues who wanted to express their support for his decision. The magnitude of what he had set in motion was becoming clear, but his primary emotion remained one of relief rather than anxiety. He had faced a moment of moral choice and had acted according to his deepest convictions, regardless of the personal cost. Whatever happened next, he would be able to look at himself in the mirror each morning with the knowledge that he had stood up for what was right when it mattered most. The weeks following Gene Hackman's dramatic walkout from Crossroads of Justice witnessed a transformation in Hollywood that few had thought possible. What began as one man's moral stand against discrimination evolved into an industry-wide reckoning that would reshape how studios approached diversity, casting, and the fundamental question of who gets to tell stories on the big screen. The reverberations of that single moment of conscience continued to spread outward like ripples in a pond, touching lives and careers in ways that even Hackman himself hadn't anticipated when he made his fateful decision to walk away from millions of dollars rather than compromise his principles. The immediate fate of Crossroads of Justice became a cautionary tale that was studied in business schools and film schools for decades to come. Unable to secure another star of Hackman's caliber willing to step into the project under the studio's revised terms, the production was officially cancelled 3 weeks after his departure. The financial losses were enormous, nearly $20 million in pre-production costs, location fees, and crew payments that could never be recovered. But the cultural cost was even higher as the industry began to grapple with the realization that its discriminatory practices had been so blatant that one of its most respected figures had felt compelled to take a public stand against them. Bradley Worthington, the studio executive whose blunt statements about market realities had triggered the crisis, found his career trajectory permanently altered by the events of that morning. Within 6 months, he had been quietly reassigned to a less prominent position within the studio hierarchy, his name forever associated with one of the most expensive moral failures in Hollywood history. Industry insiders noted with dark humor that Worthington had become a cautionary example of how quickly corporate careers could be derailed when personal prejudices collided with public scrutiny. His fall from grace served as a warning to other executives that the old ways of doing business might no longer be sustainable in an increasingly conscious entertainment landscape. But the most significant changes occurred not in corporate boardrooms, but in the day-to-day decisions that shaped which stories got told and who got to tell them. Within months of Hackman's walkout, several major studios quietly implemented new policies requiring diversity consultations for all major projects. These weren't just cosmetic changes designed to generate positive publicity. They represented genuine shifts in how the industry approached the fundamental question of representation. Talent agencies began actively recruiting African American actors, writers, and directors, recognizing that the political and cultural landscape had shifted in ways that made diversity not just morally imperative, but commercially advantageous. The impact on individual careers was profound and far-reaching. Marcus Williams, a young African-American actor who had been cast in one of the supporting roles that the studio had wanted to eliminate, found himself in unprecedented demand as other productions sought to demonstrate their commitment to inclusive casting. His agent, who had been struggling to find meaningful opportunities for her client, suddenly found herself fielding multiple offers from studios eager to avoid the kind of public relations nightmare that had engulfed Crossroads of Justice. Williams himself was deeply moved by Hackman's sacrifice, later telling journalists that Gene Hackman gave up millions of dollars for people he didn't even know personally. That kind of solidarity changes how you think about what's possible in this industry. The story of Hackman's stand resonated particularly strongly within the African American community, where it was seen as a powerful example of the kind of allyship that could create real change. Prominent civil rights leaders who had long criticized Hollywood's exclusionary practices suddenly found themselves with a concrete example of how white allies could use their privilege to challenge systemic discrimination. The symbolism was particularly powerful because Hackman had sacrificed something valuable, his own financial gain, rather than simply offering empty words of support or symbolic gestures that cost him nothing. Within the broader entertainment industry, Hackman's actions sparked a wave of soul-searching that extended far beyond issues of racial representation. Writers began questioning whether their scripts included diverse characters in meaningful ways, rather than simply as token inclusions designed to deflect criticism. Directors started examining their hiring practices, asking themselves whether they were truly seeking the best talent available or unconsciously limiting their searches to familiar networks that excluded marginalized communities. Producers found themselves defending casting decisions that they had previously made without conscious thought, forced to articulate why they believed certain actors were right for specific roles. The international dimension of the story proved particularly significant for an industry that derived an increasing percentage of its revenue from global markets, European and Asian. Distributors who had long been critical of American films' narrow representation of diversity used Hackman's example to demand better representation in the movies they agreed to distribute. Several major international film festivals announced new initiatives to promote diversity in their programming, explicitly citing Hackman's moral stand as inspiration for their own efforts to create more inclusive cultural spaces. The response from younger actors was particularly enthusiastic, as many saw Hackman's actions as proof that it was possible to have both a successful career and uncompromising principles. Acting schools began incorporating discussions of professional ethics into their curricula, using Hackman's example to teach students about the moral dimensions of their chosen profession. The story became particularly popular among film students, who saw it as evidence that individual choices could have far-reaching consequences in an industry that often seemed driven purely by commercial considerations. The financial consequences of Hackman's decision extended far beyond the immediate. Losses from Crossroads of Justice. Insurance companies began revising their policies to account for the possibility of star departures based on moral objections, recognizing that the old assumption about actors' willingness to prioritize profit over principle might no longer be reliable. This created additional costs for studios and production companies, but it also created financial incentives for more inclusive business practices, as productions with diverse casts and inclusive policies could secure insurance at lower rates. Perhaps most significantly, Hackman's actions inspired other established actors to examine their own projects through a new lens of social responsibility. Several major stars quietly withdrew from projects that they felt promoted harmful stereotypes or excluded marginalized communities, though few made their objections as public as Hackman had. The cumulative effect of these individual decisions was to create a new climate in which studios could no longer assume that talent would automatically participate in projects that perpetuated discrimination, regardless of the financial incentives involved. The story took on additional resonance as details emerged about Hackman's personal history and the experiences that had shaped his moral worldview. Journalists discovered that the actor had grown up in a working-class family during an era when racial segregation was still legal in much of the United States, and that his parents had taught him to judge people by their character rather than their skin color. Friends and colleagues shared stories of Hackman's consistent pattern of treating everyone with respect and dignity, regardless of their position in the industry hierarchy, painting a picture of a man whose public stand was entirely consistent with his private character. The academic community embraced Hackman's story as a powerful teaching tool for courses on business ethics, civil rights history, and the social responsibility of corporations. Business schools developed case studies examining the short-term costs and long-term benefits of taking moral stands in commercial contexts, while film schools used the incident to explore the relationship between artistic expression and social justice. The story became particularly popular in courses on leadership, where it was used to illustrate how individual moral courage could catalyze broader institutional change. As the months passed, it became clear that Hackman's decision had marked a genuine turning point in Hollywood's approach to diversity and representation. While progress was often slow and incomplete, the industry could no longer claim ignorance of its discriminatory practices or assume that talent would automatically acquiesce to business decisions that perpetuated inequality. The story of one actor's moral stand had become a powerful catalyst for broader conversations about justice, equality, and the responsibility of artists to use their platforms for positive change. Years later, when journalists and historians looked back on the pivotal moments that had shaped Hollywood's evolution toward greater inclusivity, Gene Hackman's walkout from crossroads of justice would be remembered as one of the most significant. It demonstrated that individual moral choices could have far-reaching consequences, that successful people had a responsibility to use their privilege to challenge injustice, and that sometimes the most powerful statement one could make was simply to say no when saying yes would compromise one's fundamental values. In an industry built on dreams and storytelling, Gene Hackman had written a new kind of story, one where integrity triumphed over profit, where moral courage created lasting change, and where a single person's willingness to sacrifice personal gain for principle could inspire an entire industry to examine its conscience. The long-term cultural impact of Hackman's decision extended far beyond the entertainment industry, becoming a touchstone for discussions about individual responsibility in the face of institutional discrimination. His example was cited in corporate boardrooms across America as executives grappled with their own moral choices, referenced in university classrooms as students studied the relationship between personal ethics and professional success, and invoked by civil rights leaders as evidence that meaningful allies could emerge from unexpected places. The story took on a life of its own, becoming part of the broader narrative about how social change occurs, not just through mass movements and legislation, but through individual moments of moral clarity that inspire others to examine their own choices. The ripple effects continued to manifest in surprising ways throughout the following decade. Young filmmakers who had been inspired by Hackman's example began creating independent films that deliberately challenged Hollywood's traditional approach to casting and storytelling. These projects, while often made on modest budgets, demonstrated that audiences were hungry for diverse stories told by diverse voices. Several of these films achieved unexpected commercial success, providing additional evidence that the industry's old assumptions about market demographics had been fundamentally flawed. The success of these independent productions created new pathways for marginalized filmmakers and actors, opening doors that might have remained closed without Hackman's initial act of moral courage. The educational impact of the story proved particularly enduring. High schools across the country began incorporating Hackman's example into their civics and ethics curricula, using it to teach students about the importance of standing up for one's beliefs, even when it comes at personal cost. The story resonated particularly strongly with young people who saw in Hackman's actions proof that individual choices could make a difference in fighting systemic injustice. Many students reported that learning about Hackman's decision had influenced their own thinking about career choices and moral responsibility, creating a generation of young people who were more conscious of the ethical dimensions of their professional decisions. The influence on other industries was equally significant. Business leaders in fields ranging from technology to finance began referencing Hackman's example when discussing corporate social responsibility and the importance of aligning business practices with stated values. The story became a powerful illustration of how short-term financial losses could be outweighed by long-term reputational benefits, as companies that demonstrated genuine commitment to diversity and inclusion often found themselves with competitive advantages in recruiting talent and attracting customers. Hackman's decision had shown that moral stands could be not just ethically correct, but strategically wise. International recognition of Hackman's actions continued to grow as the story spread beyond American borders. Film festivals in Europe, Asia, and Africa began establishing awards, specifically recognizing actors, directors, and producers who used their platforms to advance social justice causes. Several of these festivals explicitly cited Hackman's example as inspiration for their new initiatives, noting that his willingness to sacrifice personal gain for principle had demonstrated the kind of moral leadership that the global film community needed to embrace. The international attention helped cement Hackman's legacy as not just an American actor, but a global symbol of artistic integrity. The story also had profound personal impacts on the individuals who had been directly involved in the original incident. Director William Prescott, who had found himself caught between studio demands and his star's moral objections, eventually left Hollywood to teach film at a prestigious university. In interviews years later, he would describe Hackman's walkout as the most important learning experience of his career, teaching him that commercial success without moral foundation was ultimately hollow. Prescott went on to become a passionate advocate for diversity in filmmaking education, using his platform to train a new generation of directors who understood that artistic excellence and social responsibility were not competing values, but complementary ones. Marcus Williams, the young African-American actor whose role had been threatened by the studio's discriminatory demands, went on to have a successful career that included several collaborations with directors who had been inspired by Hackman's example to seek out diverse talent. Williams often spoke publicly about how Hackman's sacrifice had changed the trajectory of his career and his life, providing opportunities that might never have existed otherwise. he established a scholarship fund for aspiring minority actors, specifically noting that it was inspired by Gene Hackman's demonstration that real solidarity requires real sacrifice. The financial industry also took notice of the long-term implications of Hackman's decision. Investment firms that specialized in entertainment began developing new metrics for evaluating the risk profiles of film projects, taking into account not just traditional factors like star power and genre appeal, but also the social and ethical dimensions of the stories being told. Projects that demonstrated genuine commitment to inclusive casting and storytelling were often able to secure financing at better rates, as investors recognized that such films were less likely to face the kind of public relations disasters that could destroy profitability. Hackman's walkout had inadvertently created new financial incentives for ethical filmmaking. The story's enduring power lay partly in its demonstration that moral courage was not the exclusive province of professional activists or civil rights leaders, but could emerge from anyone with the conviction to act on their principles. Hackman had not been known as a particularly political actor before the incident. He was simply a professional who had reached a point where he could no longer reconcile his personal values with the demands of his industry. This accessibility made his example particularly powerful for ordinary people, facing their own moral choices in their professional and personal lives. As the years passed, the story took on additional layers of meaning as scholars and journalists continued to examine its significance. Some noted that Hackman's decision had come at a crucial moment in American cultural history, when conversations about race and representation were becoming increasingly prominent in public discourse. His actions had provided a concrete example of how individuals could contribute to broader social change, demonstrating that meaningful progress often began with personal decisions to refuse participation in unjust systems. The entertainment industry's evolution toward greater inclusivity was neither immediate nor complete, but Hackman's example had provided a powerful catalyst for ongoing change. Each subsequent generation of filmmakers and actors could point to his decision as evidence that it was possible to have both commercial success and moral integrity, that audiences were ready for diverse stories told by diverse voices, and that individual acts of conscience could create lasting institutional change. The story became part of Hollywood's mythology, a reminder that at its best, the entertainment industry could be a force for social progress rather than merely commercial exploitation. Today, more than 3 decades after Gene Hackman walked out of that production trailer rather than participate in racial discrimination, his decision continues to inspire new generations of artists, activists, and ordinary citizens who face their own moments of moral choice. The story has become a touchstone for anyone seeking to understand how individual integrity can create collective change, how personal sacrifice can serve broader social purposes, and how the simple act of saying no to injustice can echo through history in ways that transform entire industries and cultures. In the end, Gene Hackman's legacy extends far beyond his considerable achievements as an actor. His willingness to sacrifice immediate personal gain for long-term moral principle created a powerful example of how individual choices can reshape institutional practices, how artistic integrity and social justice can work together to create meaningful change, and how the courage to stand alone can ultimately inspire others to stand together. The story of his walk from that production trailer became a story about the possibility of transformation, the power of conscience, and the enduring truth that sometimes the most important role an artist can play is simply being willing to walk away when walking away is the right thing to do.